So we're starting into our summer series, and even though we can't meet outside in church in the park like we normally do because of COVID, Peter and I thought we would take our sermons outside and that we would begin to talk about finding God in nature while we're actually in nature. And so today I want to talk about sunsets. One of the things I've liked about being down here in Indiana for the last week or so is that every night the sunsets have been spectacular. Now where I live, there's a big hill to the west of me and there's trees and houses in the way. And so I don't always notice the sunsets. But here in these wide open spaces, you just can't help but notice them and see them. It's like they're trying to get your attention. And it got me thinking about what they mean and how they speak to us. There are a couple different perspectives on what goes on each night at the sunset. And one of them, the scientific perspective, basically tells us that as white sunlight travels through our atmosphere, it hits different molecules, and as it does so, it scatters into different wavelengths. And the ones that kind of scatter the most are the shorter wavelengths, like blue or violet. And that's why when we look up above us, it looks like the sky is blue, because that white sunlight is bouncing off particles, and the blue part is bouncing off more than the others. Now at sunset or sunrise, when the sun has to travel through more of the atmosphere to get to us, because it's traveling sort of close to the horizon and along the curvature of the earth, it means that more of that light is scattered. And since the blue light is scattered, by the time it gets to our eyes, what's left are the longer wavelengths like yellow and orange and red. And that's why sunsets and sunrises, I'm told, I haven't seen very many of them, that's why they often have those reds and those beautiful, vibrant colors, because all the blue has been stripped away from them by the time they get to us. And if they light up the clouds, it can be quite spectacular. That's one perspective on what happens during a sunset or a sunrise. The scientific perspective, it's valid, it's true, it's interesting. But I wonder if you've ever sensed that there's something deeper going on underneath, that somehow the sunset or the sunrise was trying to communicate with you, was trying to tell you something. That would be called maybe the mystical perspective. And it's this idea that there's a deeper meaning to what we see in the natural world sometimes than just the scientific explanation. And the ancient Hebrew king David was a guy who spent a lot of time outdoors. He began his life as a shepherd, and he spent all kinds of time out under the open sky. And he wrote a poem that tried to capture, I think, this mystical perspective found in Psalm 19. And he says this, he says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech, there is no language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world." So according to David, sunsets really are trying to tell us something. They're trying to get our attention somehow. They're trying to communicate something, even if it's not with words, even if it's not with language. There's a message that they're sending out to the entire world. Now, what's that message? According to David, he says they proclaim the glory of God. They declare the glory of God, and they proclaim the work of his hands. So what does that mean? Well, work of his hands, I think, is fairly simple to understand. The idea that God made them, that they have a maker, a creator. Almost like when you look at the Mona Lisa, it declares it's the work of Da Vinci's hands. Or when you look at the West Wind, it declares it's the work of Tom Thompson's hands. It's like the skies are saying, we didn't get here on our own. Someone made us. We're the work of someone's hands, figuratively. What does it mean, though, that he says that they declare the glory of God? Well, glory is one of those words that we don't always completely understand the meaning of, but it means something like splendor or abundance or honor, Or actually, the root meaning of the Hebrew word was actually weight or heaviness or substance. The word kavod. And there's a great passage in 1 Kings 8 where it talks about the priests being in the temple, and the kavod of God, the glory of God, filled the temple to such a degree that it just stopped them in their tracks and they couldn't keep going. They couldn't keep doing their duties in the temple. It was like it took their breath away. And so when we encounter this glory of God, it affects us in some way. And I wonder if you've ever felt that as you looked at a sunrise or a sunset. Or maybe as you've experienced something else in the natural world. The Bible says the whole earth is full of God's glory. Is there something in you that's just stopped in your tracks, that it takes your breath away, and you say, wow, God, that's amazing. The glory of God is all over the place. The question is, do we take time to notice? Are we paying attention? Now, a lot of people, I think, have this idea that if there is a God, he likes to play hard to get. That he's content to leave himself hidden, that he doesn't want us to somehow know about him, that he enjoys being shrouded in this cloud of mystery. But that's not the picture that the Bible paints. The Bible actually paints the picture of a God who is actively communicating with us, who's actively seeking to reach out to us, to help us know who he is and what he wants from us. There's a great passage in Isaiah 65, kind of a sad passage, where Isaiah describes God as holding out his hands all day long, crying out to his people, I'm here, but they ignore him. You see, it's not that God isn't revealing himself to us or that he doesn't want to be known. It's that we often ignore the ways that he's trying to communicate. Now, one of the ways he communicates is through the natural world, of course, through sunsets and skies and oceans and trees and all these things that give us evidence that there's something maybe more going on here. But David, if you follow along in Psalm 19, David makes this turn. He goes from talking about God's revelation in the natural world to talking about God's revelation in his written word, in his laws and commands. See, David had part of what we would call the Bible today. He had the things that were given through Moses, the commands and instructions for his people, and he had some of the other pieces, and he saw those as so valuable that he went from talking about how incredible it was that God's glory was revealed through nature to talking about how incredible it was to have the gift of God's written revelation. So listen to what he says, starting in verse 7. He says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are sure and altogether righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the comb. By them is your servant warned. In keeping them, there is great reward." See, to David and the ancient Israelites, the laws of God, the commands of God, were not a burden. They weren't an obligation or duty. They were a privilege. They were a gift, one of God's greatest gifts, the gift of clarity. That God had somehow revealed himself through Moses, through the prophets, to give his people a clearer picture of who he was and what he wanted. And so to David, having God's commands, having his laws, isn't this big burden that he struggles under the weight of. To him, those commands were more precious than gold. They were sweeter than honey. They were a great reward in and of themselves. Because God wasn't just standing aloof, waiting for us to guess what he wanted, but God had taken the initiative. Now, I understand there's some level on which the idea that God wrote a book is kind of silly, or it seems kind of silly at first. But if you think about it, if there is a God, and if that God has any sort of a loving nature, if he cares about us in any way, then it makes sense that he would want us to know him, that he would want to reveal himself to us, doesn't it? Why would he want to be unknown if he cares for us? And if he wanted to reveal himself, then it makes sense that he would do so in a way that we could receive and that we could understand. And the way that he's designed us is that we use language, we use words in order to convey ideas and to communicate. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that at some point God would use words to get our attention, to speak to us. See, if all we had were the sunsets and the skies and the trees and nature, we would know something maybe of God, but our picture would be incomplete and fuzzy. But God gives us an incredible gift by revealing himself to us in more than just pictures, but in words, in concepts, in laws and commands and precepts. And of course, it also makes sense that rather than just give them to one generation, he would provide a way that they could be passed along accurately from generation to generation. And of course, the technology that humans have always used to do that is writing. So papyrus and parchment and scrolls and books handed on from generation to generation. It makes sense, actually, that God would have provided us such a revelation if he cared about us. In fact, when you really think about it in that way, it would be surprising if God didn't have a book, if he hadn't given us some sort of written revelation. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, okay, well, it's nice to think of the Bible as God's book, but we all know that it's a human book, right? It was written by human authors. It was compiled by humans who decided what was in and what was out. And it was copied over the centuries by humans and translated by humans. And so by the time it gets to us, is there even any God left in it? It's all humans all along. And to ask that question, I think we can go back, or to answer the question, we can go back to the idea of the sunrise displaying God's glory, or the sunset displaying God's glory. See, the idea that God would communicate to us through a sunset doesn't negate the fact that it's actually the laws of physics that are causing the sunset to be beautiful. And the idea that God would provide us with a book doesn't negate the idea that he would use human authors, human compilers, human editors, human translators to get it to us. If God can speak to us through the laws of physics in a beautiful sunset, and he can reveal a bit of his glory that way, he certainly can use human beings made in his image, and he can oversee the process in order to get us just what we need to understand him better. And that's what we believe the Bible is. But, of course, when you begin to read in the Bible, what you find is that there's an even greater revelation that God has given. See, if I were God and I wanted to reveal myself to people, I can only think of one way that would be more accessible, more accurate, better than a book. And that is, and I know it's a crazy idea and it probably would never work, but if God could somehow put on human flesh, could somehow come down and live among us, if he could become human and walk our planet and be part of the human family and reveal himself to us that way, well then that would be incredible, wouldn't it? That would give us a chance to understand him in a way that a book could never allow us to understand. Well, that's of course exactly what we believe happened through Jesus, who was God's ultimate revelation. Even more than the Bible, Jesus demonstrated to us who God is, what he's all about, his life, his death, his resurrection, and his continuing reign, because we believe Jesus is still alive and still showing us who God is. And so when we look at the skies, we get a sense that God is here. That God is not just distant, but that maybe he's reaching out to us, that maybe there's something that's worth exploring. And if we have the courage to try it out and to open our hearts and our minds to it, and we dive into the scriptures, we find again that God for thousands of years has been revealing himself through words and stories and poems and prophecies and wisdom and proverbs and all these different ways to his people. And when we read in his word and we see the ways that he has tried to communicate through his written word, it points us away from itself and to the living word, Jesus, God's ultimate and final revelation of himself. God with us, Emmanuel. John, one of Jesus' disciples, looked back on his time with Jesus, his experience with Jesus, and he described it this way. He says, the Word, God's self-revelation, God's self-communication, the Word became flesh, became a human being, and lived among us. And then he says, and we have seen his glory. See, the same sense of God's substance, his weightiness, his glory, his kavod that we get when the sunset or the sunrise takes our breath away. That same sense that we're in the presence of something so much greater was absolutely present in Jesus, like no other thing on the planet. Jesus displayed and still displays the glory of God. The question that we need to ask ourselves for each of these things, the way God's showing his glory through creation, the way that he's revealing himself through the scriptures, and the way that he reveals himself through Jesus, is, are we paying attention? And that's my challenge for you this week, is simply to pay attention, to begin to open up your eyes and to notice the ways that God is already speaking to you. Not that he's waiting for you to come and find him, but that he's reaching out to you and communicating himself to you through sunsets, through the scriptures, through Jesus. And when I say through Jesus, I don't mean just as a historical figure that we can read about in the Bible, but as a living person that we can get to know and invite into our lives today. And he'll help continue to help us to understand who God is. So that's my challenge this week, is to pay attention. Now, one final thing, in the same way that where I live, sometimes I don't pay attention to the sunset because there's stuff in the way. I think sometimes we need to clear out the clutter in our lives in order to better notice, in order to better pay attention to what God is doing and to what God is already saying to us. And so my challenge for you this week would be to find some time, some space, to go to a place where maybe you can see nature clearly. Maybe you can read the Bible without any sort of hurry. And maybe you can get to know Jesus a little better, both through his word and through your own prayers and relationship with him. But sometimes when there's so much clutter in our lives, we fail to pay attention, we fail to notice. And I bet that if we clear a little space, just like I've noticed the sunsets this week, maybe you'll begin to notice the ways that God's been speaking to you all along.